And we're live. Welcome back to another Corona Geek, here where we talk all about mobile app development using Corona SDK. I'm your host, Charles McKeever, and today we have a full house. We have a talented panel of panelists who are here to represent Corona and talk about Composer. We're going to be talking about Composer Library. There's Composer GUI and there's Composer Library, and we're going to be talking about all the things that you can do with the library and kind of get into an overview of what it is, how it works, all that kind of stuff. On the panel is Brian Burton down in Abilene. Hello, Dr. Burton.
Hello.
Also joining us is Chris Byerly, developer of Coronium. Hi, Chris. Also with us is Ed Marino from Roaming Gamer.
Hello.
We've got Eric Kincaid from Lava Level, or also Questlord, if you played his game. My son actually plays Questlord and loves it. I can't wait to see Questlord 2. Also joining us is Greg Pugh from GP Animations, and then we've got this other guy that he's here sometimes, he's not here sometimes. J.A. Wise with us. Hey, Jay.
Hey.
And also we've got Mo. Hey, Mo, what's going on? Thanks for joining us. I love that icon. He's got the icon of his one of his new apps that's out. So we'll have to put that in the show notes so you guys go check it out.
Hi, Charles.
How's it going?
How are you?
Thanks for joining us.
Not
Glad
too
you're here.
bad. Just watching on the iPhone while driving.
Oh, no, don't do that.
No, my wife is driving. No worries.
Oh, okay, good. All right, we want to keep you safe. We want you back for more than just one show.
Okay. Sure, thank you.
Well, we're like I said, we're going to talk about Composer today. But before we get to that, let's talk about a few housekeeping items. If you didn't get a chance to listen to or watch Corona Geek 123, you need to do that because we talked all about Android TV publishing. And I don't know if you guys have been keeping up with CES, but apparently Sony is going to be using Android TV on all of their devices. So I think Android TV is going to be, that push. Apple TV, of course, eventually will find its way into the world in a proper manner, and I'm sure they will go at it head to head. So that was a great show. Go check it out, number 123. We also talked about working with text or native text input, if you'd rather talk about it that way. Both of those topics were presented by Greg Pugh and Ed Marina here on our panel, so they're always good for good information. So go check that out, Corona Geek 123. You can find it over at youtube.com/coronageek. That's where you can watch all of the videos that we produce here. We also talked last time briefly about jasonschroeder.com. You can go there. There's a progress ring module for Corona that you can implement a progress ring into your app using one line of code. Now, I keep talking about this every show. We've talked about it about 3 or 4 times now. I've mentioned it at least. I'd like to maybe have a segment where we look at how it actually works, but there's a great video over on his site. If you want to see how it works and grab the code, go over there and check it out, jasonschroeder.com. We'll put a link in the show notes. But it's just very well done, and it's documented really well, and it's just a great module. So go check that out. Also, if you're wanting us to talk about something specific, then we need to know about that. So for 2015, we've created a thread in the forums where you can go and put in your suggestions. So go over there, add whatever it is that you want us to talk about, so that we can either find a guest who can talk about it or put together the resources. And there's lots of people, smart people in the community. We can get somebody to come on and talk about it. So just let us know. And also, if you ever have questions about the show or want to be on the panel or anything like that, you can always send an email to questions@coronageek.com, I think. I'll put a link in the show notes. And one last announcement here: Corona is hiring. Now, if you guys haven't heard this before, it's a new year. Fuse has acquired Corona, and we're trying to ramp up some resources and get some new people in the house. So we'll put a link in the show notes. But basically, if you consider yourself an engineer, or you know someone who is an engineer and they want to work in the mobile space in an up-and-coming startup, then send them to this link that will be in the show notes. And also, one last thing here, like I said one last thing before, but this is really the one last thing, is that this month, January, we are playing Chip Chain for the Corona Geek Games for January. So if you are interested in potentially winning a $50 gift card to the online retailer of your choice, doesn't even, well, okay. I'm going to say it doesn't even have to be an online retailer, but anyway, if you are interested in $50 in gift card money, then just go over to chip-chain.com and download the app, play it on the 2-minute, what is it, the 2-minute challenge, and rack up as many points as you can, and then share a photo of your score on the Corona Geek Facebook page. So it's facebook.com/Corona Geek, and we will pick a high score winner on February 2nd. We'll announce that, and then we'll also announce our February game. So good luck to everybody, and check the Facebook page for the current leader. I can't remember who it is. It might be Greg, but I'll have to go over and look. Greg's our resident game winner around here lately. All right, does anybody on the panel have anything they want to announce before we head off into today's topic? Going once? Going twice?
You got anything, Mo?
No donuts.
Huh?
I know.
Hold on. Sorry, I wasn't sleeping. No, no. I have a bunch of apps. As you can see on my icon, I started doing quiz apps. So I have like 4 apps right now coming up in the store, in the iOS store. So go check it out. And
okay.
so far so good in terms of downloads, I guess.
Will you email us the link, or Charles? He's going to need it for the show.
Yes,
yeah,
I will send you an email.
Yeah, I have several of those links, Mo. But if you have something that you don't think I have, yeah, definitely send it.
Okay, I will. Thank you.
Sweet. Yeah. Okay. Well, then let's go ahead and move into today's topic. Then we're going to talk about Composer, like I said, and there's a lot of things you can do with Composer, but I'm going to let Ed take over this part of the conversation because he's got some. Not only does he have an overview of what Composer is, but he also has some demos that help illustrate how Composer works.
Yes, indeed. Let me get my act together here. I've already had it together.
Well, that's all right. While you're doing that, I'm going to say that we are putting together a series of videos in Corona University that talks about Composer and how it works and things like that. So look for those coming soon. And if you haven't had a chance to go over to Corona University, go to coronalabs.com/university, and there's a ton of videos over there on all the different elements of Corona. Also, on the resources here on the panel, we've got Dr. Burton with his books. He's got lots of books over at burtonsmediagroup.com. And then Jay, I know Jay's got a whole training series on video over on his site. So where do you want to go? He's waving his hands. He's got tons of videos. So whether you want to copy paste the code and have searchable code in a book, or whether you want to just sort of be able to watch it on your mobile device or whatever, then you're covered.
Okay, I'm ready if you're ready.
I'm ready if you're ready.
All right, well, so just to clarify, I'm showing a screenshot of the thing that we are not talking about today because I don't want there to be any ambiguity. Now this will be the screenshot that shows up for the show.
Okay, I'm leaving then. Bye-bye.
All right, auf Wiedersehen.
See you later, Mark.
Okay, so there's the Composer GUI editor, which is, I wouldn't even really call it that. There's the Composer tool for editing games, for creating simple levels, which is currently in beta, and it is available for people running the OS X simulator version of Corona. That is, if you have OS X, you'll be able to run this tool out of there if you've got the right license level. This is not what we're talking about today. In addition to this Composer tool, there is, let me hide this now. No, that is not what I wanted to do. Bring myself back here to screen one. I apologize. What I want to talk about is the scene management library. So back in the day, Corona had a scene management library called Storyboard. And oftentimes you'll still see a lot of questions out on the forums about Storyboard, and then people like me will chime in and say, don't use Storyboard, use Composer. Composer is the follow-on library, the currently supported library, to replace Storyboard, which will be phased out most likely later this year. So what Composer allows us to do is, if you think about a traditional game has any number of different scenes or screens. For example, a traditional game might have a splash screen, which is the screen where you might show the title of the game and your company name, maybe give a quick list of credits, like the top highlight credits. And then you'll go on to the main GUI, or the main menu, that is, which is going to be a button list typically, where you can click play or click on the options button, click on the sound button.
Ed, are we supposed to be seeing any of this?
Sir?
Are we supposed to be seeing any of that?
No, no. I
Okay.
will show you some. I'm sorry. I should put my face up, right?
Well, that's okay. I just didn't know. I just wanted to.
You're right. You're right.
If you were supposed to be
well,
showing something.
I had the Composer library page up, but
Yeah.
I'll come back there. So we have besides the main menu, some other typical screens or scenes you would have is the play GUI, which is where all the happiness happens. The options screen, things you might do there would be change the volume, turn on and off music, select a different soundtrack for the game, change the difficulty level, things like that. And then a couple of other ones you see frequently are a help screen or screens, and an about page. So a page maybe about the company or about the game itself and the tools that were used to make it. And so as a game developer, you're faced with a problem. You've got all these different kinds of content that you want to show your users, and you have to find a way to separate them and yet easily display them. And so Composer, which is, again, the follow-on to Storyboard, allows us to do this. And I wanted to say one more thing about Storyboard and thus Composer. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Storyboard really came out of a development effort to make books, because the initial Storyboard was, it did a lot of things, a lot of the same things that Composer allows us to do, but it felt to me like it was designed for making interactive books. It felt like that was the primary initial target, and then people like myself didn't use it for that. We used it to make games and separate out our interfaces, which was fine too. Now I'm going out on a limb here. Somebody from the staff may write back later and say, "No, Ed, you're wrong. We made it as a general tool." But it just felt like it, especially since the name was Storyboard, right? So.
Well, and Storyboard is a kind of that's an iOS kind of thing, right? I mean.
Is it?
Oh,
I guess that's a possibility. I hadn't considered that, coming out of the nomenclature used by iOS developers.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So I'm going to show my screen again, just probably more than briefly here. One thing I want to point out while we're talking today, and in all future shows, when in doubt, you should be looking at the online API reference. And so I'm going to give you a link for the show today, but everybody should know where this is. It's basically just docs.coronalabs.com/daily/API. That's the one I use and I suggest for everyone. Now, it may not apply to your version of the engine, but this is the one, not the engine, the SDK, but this is the one where you're going to get the most up-to-date document. Additionally, if you go to any particular entry, it's going to tell you what revision of the SDK supports this. So this is in 2533. So my point is I oftentimes see questions in forums, and it seems pretty clear to me that the person doesn't know that there's a wonderful API document out there with examples and links that lead off to tutorials and whatnot. So I just want to make sure that people are using this.
Yeah, and the documentation. Oh, we got an echo going on here. And the documentation does include examples that you can copy paste into your code. So that's always a good thing as well. The other thing that I want to point out while you're there, especially before you get into Composer, is that a lot of times people will say, "Have you read the documentation?" or "Have you whatever?" And for the most part, it seems like a lot of the pieces of Corona are straightforward enough that you could probably get away with just copy paste a piece of code and move forward, right? You may go reference some options or some parameters or whatever, but But with Composer, and you're going to get into the details here in a minute, but with Composer, it seems like it's really important to go ahead and read that documentation. And it's not very long, but I've seen questions in the forums that are specifically covered in that documentation, that if you just read the documentation, it would make a lot more sense. And hopefully by the end of our conversation, with some of the examples that Ed has, it will be even clearer because there'll be some visual representation of the concepts. So
I think I was the echoer there, so I had my microphone off. But just in case, everybody who's not chatting should have their mutes set, just so we don't have. Sometimes we have a feedback problem. So for today's Hangout, I'm going to cover, and you can't really see. I'm going to share my screen again. Not while I have the camera running. I'm going to cover a number of pre-prepared content items. So for the show, I made a sample framework that everybody will be able to download and use. And then I made a sampler to examine the transitions that are the easings that are supported by Composer. And it's what this is, you'll see in a moment, is an application that lets you interactively try out different scene transitions and change the parameters in real time so that you can get a sense of what you're going to be getting before you go and modify your own app. Then I'm going to change the order, and I'm going to show one of the most common mistakes. Now Composer, at its heart, the purpose of this tool is to provide us. I'm going to switch back to the camera here because I feel like I'm just looking at my screen. Is it provide us a way of managing our content. So, for example, let's say we have 10 objects that we want to display on the Play GUI. We want to have our spaceship and some enemies, and we want to have a couple of control buttons. But then we want to give the user the option to click on a button on that screen and go change the volume settings, go to the options page. So what we need to do is put all of our game stuff in one scene and all of our options in another and manage them. I mean, I can't believe how many questions I've seen in the forums where people say, hey, this thing isn't moving my content, or my content disappeared, and then I go and I look at the code and they're not managing their content. They're not putting their content in the Composer group. So we'll show the right way and the wrong way to do that today. And then another question that a lot of people have about Composer, and I'll probably come to this last, is the event sequence. So Composer has a number of events, which I'll show you in the code in a moment. But these events are create and destroy, which is for creating the scene and destroying the scene. And then they have, let's see, it would help if I had the code. I can't talk to it. They have will enter, will exit, and did exit. So these are all kinds of things that can occur in your game or your app when you're dealing with the scenes. Entering the scene, creating the scene, destroying the scene, exiting the scene. And these events allow you to do things in your app, your game, to manage the content at the right time. For example, let's say you're playing the game and you exit the scene. Well, you might want to mute the sound, or you might want to lower the volume, or you might want to pause the action. Any of these things are possible, and so you need some kind of event or trigger to tell you, hey, they're exiting the game proper to go do something else. And so I'll give you examples of this code and show you how it works. So enough of the what I'll show you. Why don't I just launch into something here, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I know that you're going to cover this, but I want people to pay attention when you get to the part about where to put pieces of code and why you put those pieces of code there, and how basically how the Lua file is structured for a Composer template, because it's it's not intuitive right away, but once you understand the concept, you're like, oh, okay, now I get it.
Absolutely. That's why I made the framework. and I will go over that in detail because over the years working with Storyboard and Composer, I've come up with sort of like my own best recipe, and I feel like I always try to get people to use this because for me, it works, it keeps the code organized, I never forget where things are located, it just makes sense. And also, I like to help people when their code looks like mine. So when they ask questions in the forum, if they're already sort of following my recipe, it just makes life easier. All right, so the first thing I want to show you is sort of like the fun transitions example. And so I'm going to bring this up here, and we're not going to switch screens. I do apologize. Can you see that all right? So what we've got here is the first application in the code that we're going to provide a link to, and it'll be on the GitHub, on a GitHub for people to download. And what this application does is it's got a couple of different scenes, and what we can do, can you see this little thing at the bottom? No, okay, good. I'm looking, sorry. What you see and what I see are a little bit different. Google's got a little overlay on my screen telling me I can quit at any time. I hate it.
Yeah, no, we don't see that.
So for example, why Knuckles? Okay, so for example, I want to do a fade transition that takes 1,000 milliseconds, 1 second. I set the time to 1,000 by clicking 1,000 and click fade, and it'll transition over to scene 2 and take 1,000. And then scene 2 I can set up with a different setting because it's sometimes nice to go back and forth between two. Now let's say from the right. And then I can go back from the left. And so I can just play around with different time settings and different transitions to see what I'm going to get. So I never actually used the one I just clicked on there, but I mean some of these are kind of interesting. Like that one was nice, but it was a little bit too slow for me. So I might say, well, let's make that half a second. Let's try it. Let's try it again. Let's put them both to half a second. That's still too slow. So let's make that 100 milliseconds. And that's too fast. Looks like I'm gonna. People can edit this code too. There's a list at the top. In fact, why don't I just show you while we're right here?
And you said that already, right? That all this code's going to be available to people.
Absolutely, all this code is going to be available. And if you want to go modify this particular example, you're going to want to look at the two scene definitions. So the folder itself will be, you're going to go to the Corona Geek archive that I have at the GitHub, and there's going to be one called Hangout 124. And under there is going to be Composer Scene Manager and Transition Library. Transition Library is another topic we were going to possibly talk about today, but we may not have time for. So you want to go to the Composer Scene Manager and Example 1, which is Transitions, the one we're talking about now. And the way I've got this organized is in the root directory of this application is your main config and build settings, your traditional, your typical files. And then everything else exists in a subdirectory. And for the way I write my applications typically, always I will put my scenes in a subdirectory called IFC, which is short for interfaces. So my interfaces, or my scenes, are scene 1 and scene 2, which is, if I reload the application, scene 1 and scene 2. And they have exactly the same content. I designed this so you can go back and forth between two scenes quickly with different settings. So if you want to change the timings, so example, let's go into scene 1 and let's add a 250 millisecond timing instead. Just go to the top of the file here, line 19, change that, reload it, and now we've got a 250 millisecond timing. And that's more about what I was looking for the flip. About a quarter second seems about right. So I gave some typical values, but absolutely people should go through here and change them to the ones they're looking to test. And that is about it. So that example. Now let's go ahead and fast forward a bit and look at the framework itself.
So really, just to recap there, so basically the point of that transitions demo there is so that you can without having to go through and code each one yourself. You can get a quick idea of what's possible with the transitions in Composer.
Yeah, when working with clients, a lot of times my clients will be, this will be a new concept to them. And so I'll tell them we're using a framework that allows me to put your game in one interface and your whatever screen in another, and that we're going to transition between these two by sliding left and right or cross-fading between the two. And they're like, I don't really understand that. So then what I do is I make a toolkit, very much like what I just made for the show here, and I give them some options. And I say, these are the options that we talked about. Why don't you click on these, change these values, and then experiment so you can see what I'm looking at here. Because especially when you're working with clients who are remote, having them try it and say, I like the one with a crossfade at 300 milliseconds. That's the one I feels the best to me. Let them do all the work, save yourself hours of back and forth. And anyway, small piece of advice. So you can grab this piece of code and use it directly for your own client work, in a sense. So as I said previously, I made a framework for the folks who are watching the show here, which follows a organization which I feel will work best for 99% of projects, or let's say 90 to be a little less. Most typical projects will have, among other things, a splash screen, a main menu, and you may not be able to read this on my screen because it's a little bit small, and they will have an options screen. So splash, main menu, play, GUI, and an options screen. So if you look under the interfaces folder under 5 frame, let me bring up the frame first so you can see what I'm talking about. Better to show and then talk. So I'm going to run this, and what's going to happen is it's going to launch the splash screen, which is nothing special. It's just a simple texture with a word on it to show you what scene it is. And I'm going to let it run through. It takes 2 seconds, and then it's going to go over to the main menu. Now, I set up the splash screen example so that if you wanted to, you could allow users to click it to bypass it.
And Ed, before you do that, I want to say one thing just to kind of add to that is that with Composer, typically it's recommended that you use the Composer template. There's a file that's in the documentation that you can use as a starting point for your Composer scene. Mm-hmm. It has all the code in it for all the events and everything that Ed's going to talk about, but it's one single file, and then you put your code in according to what you need. Now, what Ed's done here
is essentially that, except I've put extra organization on top of it.
Well, I like that you've gone one step further, which is acknowledging the fact that the scenes you don't have one scene in your app, right? So having the scene template is good. Having the Composer template is good, but you need to be able to wire them together and make them function, and that's what this is. This is a working example of multiple scenes in a framework that it's already kind of established for you.
Absolutely. Actually, it's a good thing you brought that up before we started here. One thing I see people do a lot is have the scene definition in main.lua, which is absolutely wrong. You can do it. In theory, you can do it, but it is absolutely wrong. You should not be doing that. You should have, that's the whole point to me. The whole point of having a scene management system is that you keep your scenes separate, in separate files, maybe even separate folders if they're really complicated. So for example, all of my scenes are very simple. They're one file. The scene contains all the code for the scene. But if I was making, and this happens sometimes, if I was making a game that had multiple levels, where the levels were somehow different, they didn't follow a similar recipe, I may make subfolders where each folder has a scene file and a bunch of support script files for that particular level or that particular part of the application. And so it's just a way of staying organized. But coming back to this example, this is the fundamental example, which has, again, it has the 3 traditional files, main, config, and build settings. Everything else is in subfolders. So we got an image folder for whatever images are in our application or game. We got a scripts folder, and that's where I put any utility scripts that I may be using. And this framework, I forgot to mention, comes with the object-oriented button class that we introduced several shows back. So, and I did that because I just too lazy. I didn't want to write up another button class just for this framework, and it worked well. Most people only use toggle and push buttons, and this one supports both, so we're good to go out of the box. And then again, IFC, which is the interfaces or the scenes. So I'm going to run this now. It's going to go to the splash screen, and in 2 seconds transition to the main menu. Then if I click on play from the main menu, that'll slide in the play GUI, and this is where my game content would be, or my application content would be. The back button merely transitions back to the main menu. And then I gave one more example, which was an options overlay. So in Composer, there's two kinds of scenes. There's a traditional scene, which is a scene that owns the screen completely. It's the only scene that is present. And then there's an overlay, which is a scene that is loaded on top of a current scene. And at this point, you can make a choice. The overlay can allow touches to go through that scene and fall onto the scene below it, or you can block that. And most people block it. It's what's called, what was it? It comes from the concept of dialogues. And I can't remember it, of course. This happens to me.
Modal?
Yes, it's modal. Exactly. Right. It's right in the flag definition. It's a modal, in a sense, dialogue, but the dialogue itself covers the entire screen. And the purpose of this is to allow you, mostly when I do it in my games, when I work with clients and for myself, is really you won't see a full screen image slide in like I just did. What it'll be is like a little dialogue box and some content and some buttons for them to push. But even if they click somewhere else on the screen, like I'm clicking on the options button right now, but this is a modal overlay. And so it says, no, the touches are not allowed to fall through to the scene underneath this. So again, we have scenes and we have overlays. And the overlay's primary purpose is to give us a nice way to slide in some content or make some content appear over an existing ongoing screen or scene without unloading that scene. So that scene could continue to be active, things are going on in the background, but we can't access them temporarily.
And I also want to throw in, just to kind of make the connection in case people haven't done it, is that you can modify the types of transitions. So earlier you showed us the sampler for the different types of transitions and speeds. And with this framework, you have provided us some default options of how those transitions might occur, but you can modify that to use any one of those transitions that was in the sampler. So if you don't want it to slide up from the top or the bottom, then you can change that.
Absolutely. I'll show you the places in the code where these transitions are set up. And then I would suggest people use the sampler to find the transitions they like and simply use the code that they see there and replace it here. Use the settings that they see on the sampler. So we'll go back to it real fast. Actually, let's look at one and just show people the example here. So the splash screen, when we run it, I click now, it'll slide from right to left. So the main menu slides in from the right. And so let me go look at the splash screen code. So the transition that I used there was slide left with a time of 500 milliseconds. So I could, let's say I just didn't like that. I can go back to the sampler, the transition sampler, and let's say I like zoom in and out with let's say 1,000 millisecond timing. So zoom in and out, and that seems right. So then I would just go over here. I'm going to make sure I'm typing it right.
It is case sensitive.
It is, in fact, case sensitive. And let's go 1000. Let's go back to the framework, click the screen, and now we get the new transition. Boom. We got to try it out in the sampler, refine it over there, put it in our app. So I'm going to undo that now. All right, let me take a chance or a moment here to give a further breakdown of this framework, which I would suggest people copy wholesale and just start using for their self-education or for their games, whatever they're working on. You'll want to start in the main file. Now, the main file doesn't have a lot of stuff going on. It's got the bare basics, and I'll walk through it. The first thing it's got is all of the files have a header at the top where you can put the name of the file that you're working on, and if you want to put a copyright statement, like all of the scenes here have a space for a copyright, so you can put your own little copyright statement, and people like to do that. Some people distribute their code and they want to put a little statement there about how people can use it. And then typically the way I organize my files is I do all of the requires at the top. If it makes sense, sometimes you need to do things prior to this, like set certain global values or set certain things up. But typically I require, and in this case I'm requiring the composer library. And then because I'm going to have a push button, or I want to initialize the push button class, I require both the push button class and the toggle button class. And then we're not going to talk about this stuff today very much, but there are some debug settings and some other settings that you can use in Composer, and those are, you can set the debug settings to true, which I leave it at the default, and what that does is the Composer will print out information to the console, telling you what it's doing, and stuff like it'll tell you when it purges a scene. It'll tell you when you get a low memory warning. Stuff like that will start to print out to the console. Pardon me. Let's bring this back up. Okay, so a couple of other settings that would be interesting to people are the recycle on low memory setting. Maybe you want to turn that off. I would suggest not. By default, that's set to true, and what that means is when memory gets low, you're using too much memory, Composer, and this is one of the beautiful things about this library, is it will say, oh look, I've got 3 scenes loaded, but only 1 active. I'm going to choose the one that was least recently active, and I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to unload it because I don't have enough memory anymore to keep this thing loaded into memory. I should back up and say that Composer strives, by default, once you've loaded a scene, to keep it loaded, but just not visible. So what this allows us to do is build up complex scenes, which may cost us time, push them off to the side, and then come back to them later and have everything be present the way it was when we pushed it aside.
Which is, I think, a normal function of what people usually think they want to do. I know early on in the storyboard days, there was things that I didn't quite get. That I wanted to create it and just wanted it to stay around, and I wanted to be able to come back to it, and that wasn't always the case.
Right. For example, like a storybook, you might want to load up several pages and then be able to transition nice and quickly to each of them. Composer, the predecessor of the successor of Storyboard, allows us to preload scenes if we wish. I'm not going to show you how to do that today. We could talk about that in the future, but it is possible to preload and build a scene and not display it, which is also a very useful thing if you've got one complicated scene following another complicated scene where you don't want to get stuck drawing the scene as part of your transition. You don't want to get this kind of like hiccupy, poor performance transition that is affected by all the work that's going on to build the scene. So you preload it, and then you just merely display it using whatever transition you're choosing to use, and it comes across nice and smoothly. The only other setting here is recycle on scene change, which by default is false. And what this does is, if you set it to true, is every time a scene is pushed aside, As soon as it's finished being pushed aside, it gets removed from memory, gets recycled. All the scene contents get deleted. Any other variables that were set up for that scene are purged. And the purpose of this is if you're running some really heavy-duty scenes or you're having problems with memory, you may want to do this, because what it will do is it'll maintain the best memory footprint possible while still maintaining the basic scene-to-scene transition capability. So it won't be as smooth necessarily on transition, but it will still allow you to manage your scenes and your memory usage, which is another reason people use Composer, is because they want help managing their memory usage. So if you're having, again, problems with a game or app using Composer, one of the first things you might try is merely going in here and setting this to true, and then trying to swap back and forth between the scenes and see if that alleviates some of the issues you're having with low memory crashes or other issues. Other things I do in this section, which is the initialization section, I almost always set the output buffer buffering to false, because once you get this thing on your device, you want all the output to come to the device's console promptly. You don't want it to get buffered. And so if you're using logcat, or if you're using the console output for Xcode, if you don't have this set, print output may be delayed somewhat temporarily, and you don't want that. Another thing I always do is I hide the status bar, which is, the little bar at the top of the screen with the clock and the battery status and whatnot, just because in the simulator I don't like to have anything in the way. And then there's some other things in this file that I'm not using here, but people typically set up, like multi-touch and enabling physics and perhaps setting the draw mode. The final line in main Lua uses the Composer library, and it goes to the scene splash with no options. And what this means is it should load splash immediately. No transition delay, nothing. It's as if I hadn't even executed main. It's as if in a sense, the scene code were below here and it just executed. This is, just for people listening, the fastest way to load a screen, versus some people put something like this. Time equals 0 is not the equivalent of no setting at all.
It still has to be evaluated, right?
It will be evaluated, and it will be at least 1 frame of delay. So I find that if you want the fastest possible way to scene transition, is no transition time set, no transition type set. Don't pass any options unless you need to send parameters. And just do this way. Because, especially for the splash screen, you want that thing to load as quickly as possible, because you're going to have your launch screen, which is the static image you provide with your application when you build it. And then the splash screen will be the very first screen that gets loaded, if you have a splash screen. So let's go ahead and look at the splash screen, and then I'll take a look at the template file. Now the template file, just to be clear here, in the interfaces folder are 4 scene definitions: splash, main menu, play GUI, and options overlay. They're all very similar, and they were all created using the template file, which I left here. So basically, if you want to add more scenes to your project, what you can do is copy this file, and let's say we wanted an about page. I would just copy it, call it about, drag it onto my editor, and do some editing to put the about content in there. Everything you're going to need for a very basic scene is in this file. I will show you the template in a moment, but let's go ahead and... Actually, why don't we start off with the template? That might make more sense. So the template scene file has, at the top of it, it has a place for you to put a copyright statement, has a location for you to put the name of the file. I like to do this because when I'm looking at my code, oftentimes I forget which file I'm looking at. I mean, I know it shows it right here, but I'm just like that. Give me another hint. I almost always put the scene name at the top and the bottom of my file, just because I'm lazy that way, or it helps me. The next thing you're always going to need in a scene is you're going to need to include Composer, or that is, I'm sorry, include, this is not C. You're going to need to require Composer to get the library, to get access to the library. And then the very first thing you're going to want to do when you're defining a new scene file is you're going to want to create a scene. So one of the functions that Composer provides is new scene. And what this returns is what you could think of as a class instance or an object, which is a scene object, which has all the hooks on it to allow it to communicate with the scene management system, the Composer scene management system. So once we've created our scene, some of the things that I like to do personally is set up a section at the top of the file where I define any variables which are going to be visible within the entire scope of the file. So all locals which will be visible anywhere after these lines in the file. Another thing is I always forward declare any functions that I'm going to define in the file that are not scene functions, and I'll show you the difference. And the reason I do this is because I like to have a listing. If you're a C programmer, you kind of know what I'm talking about. It's kind of like having the header file in one place where you list out all the functions you're going to have, and the body. Except for Lua developers, for Lua, you don't have the concept of two files, but you do have this concept of forward declaration. And what that allows us to do is create a variable, a local variable, with the name of a function, and then later on we create a function and assign it to that. But everywhere within our file we can call the function before it's even been declared. That's not exactly right. I'll show you what I mean. Another thing that I like to do, I like to localize. Now, we talked about this in a prior show. Localization is the concept of, in Lua, is you can have a function declared somewhere else, defined somewhere else, and the body of that function, if you want to use it, you need to do a lookup. So, for example, if you wanted to have a random number, typically in your code you would type math.random, and let's say we wanted to get a random number from 1 to 100, we would type some code like this. We'd say local age equals math.random, and let's say we want to make them from 10 to 20 years old. Age would then be 10 to 20, whatever came out of math random. Now, this is perfectly acceptable, but if you want that to run a little bit faster, what you would do instead is you would localize it. So what I've done here is I've said local mrand, which is a variable, and I've assigned it the handle of the random function. And so now my code, I would type mrand. And if I did this 10,000 times in a row, it'd be a lot faster than if I had done it with math random. And the reason is what's happening in Lua is every time we execute this piece of code, and this has nothing to do with Composer, but because it is part of the way I set up my files, I want people to understand why I do it. What's happening here is every time this line executes, so if I had, say, a for I equals 1 bazillion times, I'm going to do this. This would take forever because it's going to look up the function. It's going to say, aha, math. Okay, that's a global variable which points to the math library. It's going to do some math. It's going to find it in. It's going to find that pointer, in a sense, in memory, and then it's going to say dot random. Okay, now I got to go from there, and I got to find the random function. So all this work just to get to the point where it's ready to execute the code. Whereas if I do this, or up here, I already did that once. I've sort of dereferenced it in a sense. I've looked it up. I've done a lookup on where this function is. Now, it knows right where the function is. It doesn't have to do any of that previous junk. It just says, locally, where is this? Boom, found it, execute. So Go ahead, ask a question.
No, that's excellent. That makes a lot of sense, especially if you're spawning enemies or you're doing, doing whatever it is in your game. And
Absolutely. Whenever possible, if you're going to be executing any function or accessing any global variable many times within a loop, within a short period of time, within one frame, you should localize it. Localize the reference to it. And I typically localize most of my stuff at the file level visibility. So again, what we're doing here is we haven't gotten into any function definitions. We haven't written any code. Hey Mo, your speaker's on. Your thing's on. And so we haven't actually even written any functional code at this point. All we're doing is setting up locals. So anything I set up before I do a function declaration, or definition, I'm sorry, will be visible within that function. From here on down in this file, all of these variables will be accessible. This is a question of scope.
And Ed, let's point out that this is a methodology used in how Lua compiles.
Yeah.
This is a Lua issue.
It is. So I think I did point that out. But again,
okay,
it's
we'll
just.
say it again then.
Okay. So yeah. So localization is just. Okay. About scope or about localization?
About localization. Well, about the reference. Yeah, the localization.
Okay. So the localization again is just what I'm doing is I'm doing a pre-lookup. I'm doing all the math that all the instructions that would normally have to execute every time, and I'm executing them once. And then I get the benefit of not having to execute that code every single time, because I've already done it. I've sort of like pre-cached that result.
So Ed, go ahead and scroll down to a bit here. I want to show people that below this is the functions specific to Composer scene management.
Yeah. Okay, let me say one more thing. Be careful about locals in your files. There's a limit in Lua of 200 locals within scope at any one time. So don't go crazy. Don't put everything in the Lua library up here and localize everything. Once you get to 200 locals, your code will mysteriously stop working. Or you'll get some weird error and you'll be like, I don't know what that is. Don't do that. Okay, so I know we got a little distracted there, but I really wanted people to understand that all of the files have this sort of like nice setup for you in the beginning. It's a good way of setting up your code in general, and I use it for my scenes. On line 45 approximately, this may change in the future, you're going to see a comment that says scene methods. Each of the files in this framework and the template itself have this. It looks like it's on line 44, sorry. And the scene methods that I have defined, which are a little bit different from the ones that come with the Corona library, are create, which is the one that you always think of happening first. And then at the very end of the list, destroy. And I organize these. This is just the way I do things. Destroy, because in a sense, it happens last. I put it at the end. Some people like to put destroy first, whatever. Then there are, in my scene definition, which is not the same as the one provided by Corona, I'll explain why. There's a scene will enter, will exit, did exit, and then again destroy. Now, for people who have transitioned from storyboard to composer, these will look familiar because these are the same scene events, scene methods that storyboard had. Now they did this thing when they switched to composer, which is instead of having will enter and did enter as separate methods, what they did was they said we're going to have a method called show and hide, and within there we will have a sub-phase, a phase in a sense, that says will we show it or did we show it? Similarly, will we be hiding it or did we hide it? Now I understood this after I looked at it, but a lot of people got confused. when they made this transition. So one, so I didn't have to change my coding style, and two, just to make this understandable to people who are transitioning from storyboard, what I have done at the bottom of the file, and it says right here, generally do not touch below this line. I mean it. I have set up two normal composer functions, which are the show and the hide, and then I did a little magic in here and said, well, which one are you? And then if it's the will show, I call will enter, and if it's the did show, I call the did enter, because that's really what's happening. We are entering the scene, or we did enter the scene.
So hey, just to expand on that. So
Yeah.
if you're using the default template that's provided in the documentation, then show gets fired twice,
and hide gets fired twice.
And hide gets fired twice. And
Absolutely.
on each of those passes, it examines the phase.
Absolutely.
So that's I think that you're right. That is a little confusing at first, because the first time I ever even read the documentation itself, it was like, well, this function gets fired twice, and I was like, well, why does it get fired twice? But yeah, once you start understanding that it's different things are going to happen at different times, then you go, oh, okay, that makes sense. But what you've done is you've expanded out even further to say, okay, well, I just logically want to be able to think of it this way, and so you've kind of split it out.
Yeah, not only that, but almost never in coding an application have I done the same things in the will enter that I'm going to do in the did enter. Those are two separate things, and there's a reason why I want to separate them. So why not have the methods that contain my code be separate to start with? So just in a nutshell, when people get this, what I have done is sort of some of the work for you in splitting up these events, so that you don't have to think about it. You just put the code in the place that makes the most sense to you, and it'll execute at the proper time. This is one of those things, as you mentioned, that I see people getting confused about all the time in the forums. The question I see all the time is, hey, I put this code in the show, and now I got two objects when I expected to have one. And the answer is always, well, did you check the phase to see if it was will or did?
Yeah. And if you look at iOS, the way iOS does it, it breaks it out into I don't remember exactly what the function names are, but it basically breaks it out into a will or a did. It breaks them out like you've broken them out. It breaks them out into logical functions, as opposed to looping through the same function twice and checking a phase or something like that. So it's a little more like iOS is what you've set up here. Yeah.
Well, actually, as I said earlier, I was so used to using the storyboard names that I just said, I don't want to remember something new. I'm going to make this look like storyboard. In a sense.
Back in my day.
That's right. Okay, I'm going to speed things up a little bit here because I really want to show one of the major mistakes that people make. But
I'll just say that we're going to cover a little bit more here today. If we don't get to everything, we'll break this up into different sessions. So we will eventually cover everything. If anyone needs to leave, drop off the panel or whatever, you're more than welcome to. You can always catch the end of the show later on. But we're gonna stay on and cover what we need to cover for today at least.
Yeah. So right. I mean, and everything, all the code will be available to people. Even if we don't get to it all, they can take a look at it. But so the template again has the top part, which I've shown you. It's got the scene methods for you to fill in. The template itself comes with some default content, which is most useful for me when I first set up a scene, like a simple background, a label, and that tells me what the scene is, and then a button that I might do something with. And it's worthwhile to point out that this button here, I'm passing in the function on push 1, which I declared up here, but which, as of yet, as you go down the file, has not been defined. And so this is a case of using forward declaration. This is where it makes sense, because if I had not forward declared it, I would have had to put the body of the function up here, which may be a really ugly way to organize your code. What I'm doing by forward declaring is saying the very next thing you see will always be my scene content, these scene methods, and then at the bottom of the file, I will start to actually put the bodies of all these little utility functions and push button responses and all that other stuff. That way, when you look at any one of my scene files, they will always be organized the same way. You'll know that within a couple hundred lines of the top of the file, you're going to start seeing the method definitions for the scenes. It's just well organized in the sense that you always know where everything's going to be.
Yeah, I always told my wife, I said, when we first got married, I said, I don't know why, but I have this thing of I always put everything in the same place because I always thought that if I were to go blind, I would want to I want to be able to move around the house and know where everything is.
Absolutely.
I have no idea
I'm
why.
with you on that one.
But it makes complete sense in code as
I'm
well.
completely obsessive with always putting my things in the same place. So that's about it. Now let's go on and let's take a look at one of the major examples of things that people do wrong with Composer when they don't quite. The first time a lot of new developers use Composer, it's like they think it's magic. And it's not. It's not doing anything for you automatically that you don't help it do. And the thing you need to help it do is manage your content. So I'm going to show you what the bad thing, I'm going to show you the wrong way and the right way, what it will look like, and then I'll show you the code to explain why it didn't work and then why it did work. So there are two examples. One's called bad management and one's called good management. Let me show you the directory here so it's really clear. So there is, within the Composer Scene Manager, which is in Hangout 124, folder 3, bad management, folder 4, good management. So let's look at bad management. Okay, both of these examples are going to be exactly the same. They're going to have two scenes. Scene 1 will randomly draw some red dots. Scene 2 will randomly draw some green dots. Both of them will have a button that allows us to transition back and forth between the scenes. Now, ideally, what would happen here is that the scenes would own the content, and when they transition away, that content would get removed. That's what I wanted to do. But when I do the bad management example and I click Scene button 2, Scene 1 comes in. So, I'm sorry, Scene 2 comes in. I get the green dots, but my red dots are still here. What happened? Then I click Scene 1. I go back to Scene 1. I get more red dots. So what this tells me, as an experienced Composer user, is that the Composer is not managing my content. It doesn't know about my dots. What we should see is this. Let's look at good management. Same thing, random red dots. Click Scene 2. The red dots get taken away. The green dots slid in, which means that they got drawn, and that the scene management system then brought them on screen.
Yeah, I think this is a really common thing because, like we mentioned before, you'll go into the documentation, grab the scene template, create yourself a file, a scene 1, and then copy that to have a scene 2, and then create a transition between the two, and go, hey, what happened? The things don't work the way you think they do, but it's like you're saying, you have to do it a certain way, and you're about to tell us what the way is.
Right. So let me show you the difference between these two scene files. This is so simple. It just boggles the mind, but people do this over and over. And I know. I'm not picking on people. I should be nice. It's an easy mistake to make, and it's an easy mistake to fix, and I'm going to show you how to fix it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you side by side one of the scene files from the wrong way, which is on the left side, and a scene file on the right way, which is on the right side. And both of these are exactly the same with one small change. Let's go down to our creation method. And in this example, I'm doing all the creation right in the body. I don't have any special functions that are defined somewhere else to do the building. Everything's done right here in the method. On the left side, what I've done is I start it, my code starts up, I print out a little comment. This is just for me, so I know that it's starting. I look in the event and I grab self.view, which is the group that is supplied by Composer for managing my content. It's a scene group. It's a typical traditional scene group as provided by Corona. It's a standard content container to put objects in, to move them around, to manage them, to delete them all at once, stuff like that. So what did I do? Let's skip down to the part where I make the circles, which is where I made the mistake. Down here I call display new circle, and I choose a random x coordinate, random y coordinate, and I choose a random radius between 10 and 20. That's what these little bits of code are doing. But nowhere in here did I take the time to insert my circle into the group. So what happens instead is Corona says, oh, you don't want me to put it in a special group? I'll put it in the default group, which is the top group, the current group. And so at this point, the circles are not owned by anybody. They're not managed by the scene. Scene doesn't know about them. Very, very simple mistake, easily corrected. All you got to do, let me see if I can get these both to show at the same time, or at least enough of the code. So all I've done here, same function call, but the very first argument I pass in the screen group. Now another way to do this is like this. I'll show you, because I notice a lot of people do not use this format. I don't understand why, but whatever, everybody can do things the way they like. Create the object just like you did before, but then do this. I'll blow it up a little bit so you can see it. Two right ways to do this are pass screen group as the first argument. What that will do is it will insert the circle into the composer group that is being managed by this scene, and the composer group, this scene will then own it. It'll move it, it'll delete it, take care of the memory management, everything, all taken care of for you. Or make a circle, do not pass the screen group in, instead do it the old way, the x and y coordinates first, and then call screen group, which is a scene group in Corona, and say insert and the handle, which I stored right here. I got the handle to the circle, pass that in, and insert it into the group. Same exact thing.
And
personally, I'm a one-line programmer. Go ahead.
If I'm teaching this to a group of people that are just learning how to use groups or how to do scene management this way, the second method is usually much easier to understand. It just simply makes more sense to break it into two separate lines.
Right. I understand that where people are coming from as far as why they do it this way. The thing I don't understand is why people don't eventually graduate to doing it in one line.
Right.
There's a difference here. I said these are exactly the same. That is not true. There is something you can do on this line of code that you cannot do by doing it this way, which is there's the option with insert to tell the Corona system, do not translate the coordinates for me. So if your group has been offset by a certain amount, and I call this line of code, and my circle is at coordinates 10, 10, and my group has been moved to the right by 10, really, my circle is going to show up at 0, 10 on the screen. So this one's at minus 10, this one's at plus 10. The way it visually appears on the screen is 0, 10. But you can, I believe you can set this to false. It's been a while since I've done this. And then what Corona will do is say, oh, you don't want me to add these coordinates together? you want this to literally be the same position it's currently at on the screen, it will then be at 1010. But within the group, it'll have been translated over to -10 or +10. This is why I don't do it, because I can't even give you the example. I get it all messed up in my head. The point is, do I automatically move it for you or not? That's the choice you're making here with this additional argument to insert. So I think that's going to be about all we got time to cover as far as looking at code today. I did want to make sure we looked at all the examples. So we looked at the framework. We looked at, event sequence. I just wanted to show this to you real fast for people who want to run this code later.
Well,
Another thing that people...
Before you get to that real quick, I just want to point out that the Composer template, while it provides a framework for being able to manage your scenes, I think it's important to recognize that's just a Lua file. It's just a Lua file that's provided to you in a with a standard set of functions, and like you said, pointed out before, it's organized in a particular way. But ultimately, it's still just a Lua file, and like you said before, there's not really any magic going on there. You still have to tell the code what you want to happen. You still have to say, hey, I want to add these objects to this group. And by doing that, you are enabling Composer to then help you with memory management and object management, those types of things. But it's not just going to do that just because you put those objects into that particular Lua file. So I think that is definitely a confusion point. It's a little, it's a lot more clear when you read the documentation on Composer. So if I know people always kind of jump all over. No matter where you go, you always get, read the documentation. But like we said before, working with Composer is one of those instances where it will greatly benefit you if you read the documentation ahead of time and kind of get an idea of how it all works before you just sort of dive in and start putting things on the page and then not understanding why they don't work.
All right. I say, especially with what you're saying, is make sure to look at the API references and read the code samples below the description, not just the description itself. Take a look at the code that people have, the staff have taken the time to give you as examples, because that'll really help clarify some of the mysterious seeming problems with any of these APIs, not just Composer.
But there's a couple of things that we'll probably get to in the next session, but I mean, putting things into the group like that is probably the biggest one.
That's the number one issue I've seen people make, is not managing their content by not putting it in the group.
So once you get once you wrap your mind around these types of concepts, these few kind of gotchas, the rest of it's pretty straightforward. So don't think that it's overly complicated or unapproachable. It's just a matter of, okay, you need to make sure that you are aware of how it's actually functioning, and then be able to to work with it properly. So
okay, now, I know we're a little bit over time, but I do want to make a comment here. I've been talking, but there's been a side discussion going on here in the group chat, which I just had a chance to sort of catch up on. And there's a valid point made here by some of the guests today, which is, I showed you my file where I put the scene definitions at the top, and then all of my extra utility functions sort of at the bottom. And Jay, he does his the other way, unless I'm not reading that correctly. He puts his utility functions at the top, and then his scene definitions or his scene methods at the bottom. And I want to say that that's absolutely valid. And it's a question of, the reason I set my file up this way is most new users will put the bulk of their scene creation content right in the methods, which is not a great way to do it, because eventually your scene methods are going to get so big that it's sort of like spaghetti code. But most people start off that way, and so I put the code that I'm going to access the most towards the top of the file. Now Jay is a much more advanced programmer than many of the users in the community, and so he's already in the habit of having utility functions that sort of like break down the work into small, short functions that do just the thing they're supposed to do. And then he's going to use functions like builder functions to build objects and spawners and all that stuff, and just make a limited number of calls within the actual create method. And therefore, because the most of the code that he's accessing and editing and modifying and maintaining is those little functions, it makes more sense that they be at the top, because who wants to page down all the time?
And I'll tag onto that and say, either way works. I think the main point, and that's the one that you made earlier, was that just be consistent.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, everybody in the future, I will always organize mine this way, just because that's the way I've gotten very used to it, and so you should see my code this way. So I'm going to give one more thing, which is I wanted to show you the sequence thing, and then I'll shut the heck up for today. One of the things that people have a lot of problems understanding is, when does the create happen versus the will enter, or did exit versus the will exit from another scene. And so there's a 2 event sequence sampler out here, and what it does is it starts off with a start button, which once you press it, it will load scene 1. And when it does that, right on the screen, it's going to print out the sequence of events that occurred for scene 1. It created scene 1, then the will enter event happened, and then the did enter event happened. Then it's got some buttons. Oh, and it's got a label at the top to tell you where you're at. So we're in scene 1. I can click on scene 2. It's going to load scene 2. Puts a little separator here, and it says will exit scene 1, create scene 2, will enter scene 2, did enter scene 2, did exit scene 1. So for those of you out there who are like, which one comes first? Here, just use this, run it a couple times, and it'll all become clear. Now if we go back to scene 1, will exit scene 2, will enter scene 1, did enter scene 1, did exit scene 2. Just what you would expect. The creation has already been done. The scene did not get destroyed. Therefore, no more creates will be called. Not for scene 1 or scene 2. If we do the overlay, then we get a create and a will enter overlay, did enter overlay. Now this is interesting. What about the exits? We did not exit scene 1. It's still there. Therefore, none of the exits get called.
It's funny because I remember doing this exact same thing with storyboard. I remember going through.
Everybody has to do this once.
Yeah. Otherwise, you just don't
get
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I typed this idea from an app that I made for storyboard to answer a question very long ago. Except this one's a little bit better. It's funny. 2 of the examples that I made for the show today were examples that I made a long time ago, but because the code has gotten better, it was easier to put these things together in a much more accessible visual format, where I could put the thing right on the screen and people could see what was going on. And anyways, I mean, I could have done that theoretically with storyboard too, but.
Hey Ed.
Yeah.
Composer still has the situation like storyboard where even if you move from a scene, there's still there can still be code left in memory as opposed to your visual layer. Is that still the case?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I know what you're asking. Composer scenes, if you keep them in separate files, which is the correct way to do it, those scene files are also modules. So all the code that has been defined there, all the functions, will still exist in memory until the scene gets managed out of memory. But and that what I'm saying here is the and I have to check on this. The scene body definitions can get unloaded, but I'm not sure whether or not your extra functions, which are loaded into memory, will get unloaded. Or let's say you created like a big table at the file level and you populated that. I can't remember when the scene gets refreshed, or not refreshed, when it gets recycled. I can't remember if that gets unloaded or not. I believe it's still in memory.
Yeah, because I think there's a specific function that you can use to force it to clear out. But that
There,
might be
yeah, there
something
is.
you might
There
want
is.
to talk about that next time because I think that's important because that'll
That
keep your
is
memory.
actually. Yeah,
Um,
actually, just to respond directly to what Chris is saying here, I think what we'll do in a future show, not necessarily next show, is I will add an example to the 5 examples that are there, demonstrating the results of memory management and usage, so we can see when memory gets cleared and not. And what that'll have is it'll basically be sort of like the example I just showed you, except it'll show you how much memory is in usage as we go back and forth between the scenes.
cool. Yeah, I think that'd be neat.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, cool. So, all right. Well, I think that's good for today, huh? Did you have anything else that you wanted to cover?
No, I've talked myself dry.
Okay. I talked myself dry. Well, I think that's good. That's a good stopping place, and we will come back to this. Let's do it next week. Let's come back to Composer next week and finish up whatever we have there. And then as we move forward, we'll go into transitions. Let's figure out a time frame of when we'll do that. But
Yeah. Hey, on transitions, if people have specific questions that they know of in advance, they should post them in the forums, in the thread that we have for that, or email us or something. So I've only got one example for transitions next week, and I'm sure there are things that people would like to talk about more, like issues that they have, like simultaneous transitions and canceling and tags and all that stuff. Whatever people want to talk about most, I'd like to cover that.
okay, well, we'll do that. So if people don't know that what we're doing now is we're creating threads or conversations in the forum where you can either discuss the topics that were discussed on the show, or if you'd like to throw a question in ahead of time for an upcoming show, you can say, hey, I'd like to cover this particular piece, and whatever, just a place where we can have a conversation. So we'll link to both of those in the show notes so that you can go and either comment on this particular show, or you can ask a question for one of the upcoming shows, and we'll try to cover it. So, all right. All right. Well, does anybody, real quick, does anybody on the panel have a question or a statement or anything? Jay, you look like you're busting at the seams. You got. Come on now. You got something to say.
No, I don't really have anything to say. I enjoyed that. I learned something new. So it was I give it a thumbs up.
Oh, sweet. Awesome. Yeah.
That's awesome. If Jay learned something new, I did something right.
That's how I felt too. I was like, all right. Jay learned something today. All right. Well, hopefully you learned something today as well. And if you have questions, post them. Let us know. We will try to respond to them as much as possible. And until then, have a great week and happy coding.
Auf Wiedersehen.